This is the Enragé, a show where we take a deeper dive into written works published at the Center for a Stateless Society. Join us as we give voice to the ideas challenging the vain phantoms that haunt our social reality and stand in the way of total liberation. For more information, visit c4ss.org. And to support this show or any of the other projects happening at the Center, please visit patreon.com/c4ss.org. Thank you for listening.
Hello, and thank you for tuning in to the 16th installment of the Enragé. This is once again not Joel Williamson, but this is still the Enragé. I'm your replacement host, Eric Fleischman. I'll be taking over for Joel on this podcast for the foreseeable future, so buckle up and enjoy the ride. Today we'll be joined by Dawie Coetzee to discuss his article, Towards Prefigurative Design. Dawie Coetzee is a former architect based in Cape Town, South Africa. He has described his position as roughly where the anarchic end of Chestertonian distributism overlaps the individualist end of Proudhonian mutualism. His particular fields of interest include urban design and automotive history, though each of those is linked to a broader underlying philosophy. Dawie, welcome to the show.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm fine, and yourself?
I'm also very well. How's South Africa this time of year?
Well, we're settling into winter, and my wife and I are both winter people, so we're enjoying a wet, drizzly weekend.
I can't deny I'm a little jealous up here in the northern hemisphere. It's turning pretty warm pretty quickly, and I am also a winter person. So to jump right in, can you please give our listeners a brief overview of your article and your motivations for writing it?
I've been, I think, since about the 90s, I was sort of aware of the idea that design has consequences in that it results in establishing interests in the continuation of what you do. If you specify a certain material, you would like that material to remain available, etc., etc. And also aware of the problem of trying to design for conditions which don't apply yet, which don't exist yet. Coming out of that, I long had the idea of that prefiguration as a design aim ought to be a thing. So I was in the article. I'm proposing a strategy for how to go about design and what the role of design can be right now in terms of bringing about a set of tools to allow other people to continue doing design in a completely different context.
Yeah, absolutely. And in your bio, and you just mentioned since the 90s, you have a background in design.
Yes.
In particular, in your bio, you talk about urban design and automotive history. Do you think you could talk a bit about that background and how it influenced this article?
Well, it's been a perennial frustration, wanting very much to design for the desired context rather than the context in front of me, and having no understanding for that approach from others. And yes, it's tricky. It's tricky trying to design simultaneously for what I see before me and for what I'd like to see, because those two things can be contradictory. So yes, that was an ongoing frustration. There was also the thing of what design does, especially in architecture, which involves large investments over time, and the way that what I do now can basically tie up a site or a piece of urban fabric for many years afterwards, simply because a lot of money has been pushed into it. While I was living in Pretoria, I was fond of walking around the city and sort of imagining what could happen on this block, on this street, etc., and how that would make the place better, especially where I see some presently low-value fabric, which is actually crying out for something to be done. And then what does done in the end goes off in the wrong direction, and I just get a feeling that an opportunity has been lost, and that opportunity can't be regained for years to come because so much money has been put into doing it wrong.
Yeah.
So it basically comes out of those frustrations and the frustration of people I work with not seeing the point of designing for time, designing for the way things can change, designing for the way the product can change over time.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even just the other day, outside of my the apartment I was living in, large loud noise, excuse me. Outside the apartment I was living in, they were replacing the concrete for the 5th time in like 10 years, and there's no perspective on how sort of a long-term investment in like a sustainable and reusable material is of importance, because it's just about the short-term gain.
Yes, the sustainability aspect is definitely a huge part of that, and part of that is the durability aspect. But there's another aspect in that what's built is specifically suited for a pattern, for a structure, for a functional structure, a cultural structure, and that might not be the one that we want. So we end up building stuff which is in the way of what we want in the end.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we just talked about the design section.
Yes.
Now the prefigurative part. In your article, something is making a loud noise. In your article, you mentioned the use of prefigurative politics by the anti-globalization movement, Occupy, Black Lives Matter. How do you see these movements as acting prefiguratively, and how does that influence your idea of design?
I'd had this idea of designing ahead, as I sort of hinted at before, and I noticed the term prefigurative cropping up in the politics of protest, and that's a little bit something else. That's sort of ties to temporary autonomous zones that you get from Peter Lamborn Wilson. That sort of thinking, where there's an attempt to create a different functional structure temporarily, but that's done on a political level. And I was hoping to find some sort of tie-up of this principle of prefiguration with design itself. And I went and did my search and didn't really find anything. So yes, it's something slightly different to what I was trying to achieve in the article.
Yeah. So, in your most concise definition, what is prefigurative design, and what are some examples?
As I said before, it's designing ahead. It's designing with a view to a future use, which might be completely different to the immediate use, and that carries with it the challenge of pulling off both at the same time. I think examples would be in architecture, very definitely. Designing a building which can change its function, it can change its pattern of use. For instance, a project that I was working on fairly recently, unfortunately didn't come to much. There were fairly onerous parking requirements, and my approach was to do the ground floor as partly parking and partly a ground floor flat, with the idea that the wall between them can move, not easily, not sort of from day to day, but it's fairly easy to knock that wall down and build it in a different place without having to redesign the entire structure of the building. So as needs change, you can actually have the ground floor flat being converted into workshop space or retail or whatever, and it eating into the parking, so the parking becomes less and the other functions become more. So that's a very practical example.
That's super interesting. That speaks a lot to how, like you were saying, that sort of the design that it currently exists is very like fixed and short-sighted, in the sense that, like, I mean, I drove down through Boston today and I could barely find parking. And so if there was a way that architecture would work, that if you needed more housing, then you could make it more housing. If you need more parking, it'd be more parking. Gives more of like a organic level to
yes. It's that's the one half of the other half is recognizing the degree to which the world as we experience it is engineered. I hesitate to use the word because I'm not talking about a conspiracy or anything. I'm talking about interested policy tending to perpetuate itself. So we find a world which we experience as having grown naturally, which is instead very much the product of definite policy and design at an infrastructural level in accordance with that policy, which is why you had to drive down through Boston and couldn't walk because your destination wasn't 15 minutes walk from where you were anyway. Or you couldn't take some sort of public transport, or maybe you could, but the sort of obvious, available, easiest, most convenient way of getting from A to B was to get in your car and drive.
Yeah.
So once we understand that's not just a default thing. It's not just that's how the world is. It was actually built that way, and it gives a good starting point, namely to unbuild all that, and then we can get to that organic thing where it can go in all kinds of directions.
Well, you kind of anticipated my next question, so I'll ask it. We can skip by it if need be.
Sorry if not.
No, you're good. What are some designs in our present society that presuppose the present socioeconomic order?
Yes, I think the obvious one is the one that I've just mentioned. I think I also mentioned in the article is the way cities are designed to be, quite obviously to be car dependent, but also to be high consumption environments, and being car dependent is part of that. It's an environment where it's centered around a middle class having to spend a lot of money to absorb industrial output. Kevin Carson has written a lot about that aspect. And then you get the situation that because the world has been designed to consume, there's a lot of people who aren't able to keep up with that. So the world isn't really set up for the poor, the people who actually can't afford that level of consumption.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So to kind of jump into the meat of the article, you say that the role you see for design is to develop a number of, quote, typologies, patterns, and heuristics to fast track the replacement, which would ordinarily have been a slow process, of those extinguished by the suppression of vernacular design due to mass production and design professional elitism under industrial capitalism.
Yes.
How might one go about generating these fast-tracked models without giving in to the convenience of universality that can be seen in the design and production under capitalism? And does it relate to, say, open source technology or peer-to-peer sharing?
I think it definitely relates to open source and peer to peer and the rest of it. The I've taken part in some open source hardware projects, and what I'm seeing there is an inability to make a certain leap from a specification bound model to a pattern bound model,
Mm-hmm.
where people are still thinking in terms of a production product, a thing which can be repeated identically X number of times, rather than a pattern which is stretchable, it's adaptable, it's translatable from one dimensional regime to another. You can set it up in imperial, you can set it up in metric, you can set it up in a system of measurement that nobody's ever heard of, because the relationship of parts is there, and how you actually make the parts is up to you. So what I'd like to see is a demonstration of products put on the landscape as demonstrations of those relationships, rather than bring your tape measure and measure this thing up and then copy it. It's more like understanding how the relationships work and going away and reapplying that in a way that works for you.
Yeah, it reminds me of this idea that I actually wrote recently about, but is from this book called Walk Out, Walk On, called Scaling Across, where it's scaling across. It's like where capitalism scales up, like it tries to repeat the same design over and over again, bigger and bigger and bigger. Scaling across is about like sharing ideas so that they can be used within local contexts.
Yes, yes. And adapted to different technological traditions. This idea that I mentioned before about the retail or workshop space that can eat up parking can translate. I'd set it out in our tradition of heavy masonry construction. But it can very easily translate into American timber construction. There's nothing about it which says that it must be this type of structure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Kind of in the previous question, I used the term heuristics, which you use a lot in your article. Yes. I had to look up what that meant. So one of the central terms you use is heuristics, which Wikipedia defines as any approach to problem solving or self-discovery that employs a practical method that is not guaranteed to be optimal, perfect, or rational, but is nevertheless sufficient for reaching an immediate short-term goal or approximation. Apologists for capitalism often argue that its system of design principles and mass production maximizes efficiency. Why is heuristic design superior for a post-capitalist future? And would you say that efficiency is still a goal of prefigurative design?
There are a couple of issues here. First of all, we need to ask at what type of volume does the capitalist production model reach its purported efficiency, and that is very often at a volume far greater than any amount of demand has to be, and very often the demand needs to be manufactured. And I'm not so much talking about advertising. I think advertising plays a relatively minor role. I think the major role is in policy around infrastructure and things like that. So we create that high consumption environment that I spoke about earlier in order to create a demand for a production strategy which only works efficiently at an output far in excess of what we would otherwise need. The The second point is efficiency is a little bit of a funny term because it has different meanings in, for instance, economics and in physics, etc., etc. There are different efficiencies, and in the physics sense, it's problematic because it's a ratio. It's return on investment. It's output per input, and we're not necessarily looking for that ratio. We're looking for absolute reduction or absolute increase very often. So there has been some thinking questioning the applicability of efficiency as a metric. But I think to get back to what your question's actually about is I think that design by heuristic is one way of creating a situation where pretty much everyone is doing design. Because, as I also say, not everyone is inclined to reinvent the wheel every time. There's an example right there. Is the wheel as such is a heuristic. You want something that rolls, the wheel is right there. Use it.
Mm-hmm.
So, as the wheel is right there, everyone understands a round thing with an axle. There can be other things which might have been on the landscape were it not for the direction that production technology has gone since the 18th century. So yes, that's what I'm getting. That's what I'm trying to get back, is to sort of counterfactually speculate on what those heuristics might have been had it not gone that way.
That's really interesting. Looking back to go forward.
Oh yes, yes. Yeah, I think I actually wrote something more about that recently. If you use the metaphor of plant growth for the development of technology, you put the plant in a dark closet, and you only get growth at the very tip of the plant, the growth tip. Put it out in sunlight, and you can get growth at any point along its length, or any point in the sort of network that it makes. So, with the benefit of hindsight, we can actually go back to previous points along the development and develop something else as a side branch. It's just a multiplication of possibility.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a non-deterministic approach to design.
Yes.
I think one thing that my previous two questions touch upon is this tension in your article between modeling, particularly prefigurative modeling, and a spontaneity/local variation. For example, you talk about how, quote, a prescriptive anarchism is a contradiction in terms,
Yes.
but also that, quote, nevertheless, you had the intuition to design right now what might be useful after all. I think in particular of your discussion of Barnes, 19th century Barnes, how there was a set of design heuristics existing as a cultural commons in a regional community, and that produced a wide variety of barns, but all with sort of like the same broad pattern.
I think it was just a matter of convenience. Those things were there. Why not do it that way? But there was nothing prescriptive about it.
Mm-hmm.
Any person is free at any time to stick any innovation, be it successful or not, into this thing and to see what happens. And that's actually what I'd like to see happen, is someone to take the idea and run with it.
So would you say that the tension isn't even there between the modeling and spontaneity?
No, that's exactly why I'm thinking in terms of patterns and typologies rather than a pre-design. It's not a pre-design. It's basically a set of design tools manifest in an example, in an exemplar placed in people's life world for them to see.
Mm-hmm.
They don't need to use it. They can just walk past it. They can find it interesting. They can find it boring. They can go and measure things up if they want. If the curiosity is there, they can basically do what they want with it. Practical example, I'm seeing building a demonstrator house to embody a different type of household format, a different sort of family structure, but in such a way that people can actually get an idea of how it works. How does the planning work? Perhaps publish the plans, or perhaps put the plans up outside the building just to get the building to explain itself.
And maybe so that's where some open source type thing comes in.
Yes.
And so basically what you're saying is like you want the ability for anybody to be able to go about looking at design and considering design as opposed to just sort of like taking it as it comes.
Yes.
And so you say in your article that, quote, the ability to design from first principles and moreover to derive joy from the process really does seem to be quite scarce in society. In particular because, quote, modernist industrial capitalism arrogates the role of design to a professional elite.
Yes, I'm speculating there as to whether that is actually a cause, but it's something that we it's become a way of experiencing the world. We tend to experience the manufactured world, not like one of a community of artisans. In other words, experiencing the world as something made by people pretty much like me. But instead, we experience the world like shoppers. Our idea of how do we get stuff is we go to the stuff shop and we go and look on the shelves and we take the stuff that we want and we buy it. Not a question of we get stuff by someone who is basically like me making it.
Yeah. Do you feel that this relates to the more Marxist idea of like commodity fetishism and alienation of workers from commodities that they produce?
Alienation, definitely. I think commodification is a little bit more specific. I wouldn't want to go into that right now. I think I need to think it through first. But alienation, definitely. I tend to use a very obscure term, cognitive marginalization, and I see a lot of the ills in society, a lot of the violence in society, as stemming in part from that. The idea that we don't experience the world as something to which we can contribute our authorship.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And does joy play a central role?
For me, it definitely does. It's just it's fun. Designing stuff and actually seeing it work is fun. It's extremely satisfying.
Yeah, absolutely. The only thing I've ever designed really is I sew patches onto things like from punk music and stuff, and I always feel very satisfied once I put that all together.
I've got some Franken jeans which have been cannibalized from various different garments. They're sort of a work in progress. I can't actually wear them at the moment because they've got holes where they shouldn't be. But yes, so you understand that.
Yeah, and so we talked a little bit about the design work that you're already doing right now. Are there any technologies or systems existing or emerging right now that you think might help facilitate the movement towards prefigurative design, like 3D printing, maker spaces, stuff like that?
I think 3D printing can definitely have a role. I think there's a tendency to fetishize it. I think a place where it's less likely to have a role is in construction, because as things stand now, firstly, the bit that 3D printing is used for isn't where the problem lies. That works quite well. Building walls is fine.
Mm-hmm.
The problem of construction is not how to build a wall. It's how to make the fiddly stuff, the fittings and the components and stuff, door locks, light switches. Those are the things which need to be made in a better way. And so, yes, to take that example, I can definitely see a door lock as existing as a set of DXF files for laser printing or waterjet printing, and these files get passed from hand to hand, as it were, and you get hold of some sheet metal, and you have this set of cutout plates. Either do it yourself or someone in your community does it, and you screw them together, and you've got a door lock. And that's fairly straightforward. It's like the technology is right there. It's just a question of promoting it, basically. And again, if there's one set of DXFs floating around, there's no reason why there couldn't be 10 more from different sources, and you can mix and match. You can even develop hybrid door locks which use mechanism A from one and mechanism B from the other, and your product is the bit which connects them.
And so my final question, well, not my final question, but my final question about the article itself, and you may have just answered it by talking about locks, is if you could design or modify anything at this moment that you think would be most interesting and or useful for a post-capitalist future, what would it be?
Well, most interesting personally to me would be in the automotive field. And a long-running project of mine is to develop a system of suspension which makes torsional rigidity of the vehicle structure redundant, meaning that the person building the chassis is not necessarily the same person who builds the body.
Mm-hmm.
And that's actually more fun on my part. I just like to crack this technological nut, and I'd also sort of dream of the possibilities of what I could personally for myself build with that. I think I'm a car nut, but I wouldn't like to see cars being as central to the scheme of things as they are now, not by a long shot.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of my other thinking is about making cars redundant. So a design that I think could do much more good is the one that I alluded to earlier. Is a demonstrator house of oriented towards a different way of settling, a different way of requiring people to move in an urban landscape. House which suits itself better to a 15-minute walking radius as a complete economic sphere.
Yeah, that's super interesting and kind of auspicious though, right? As you said car, I heard a car honk in the background. It speaks to the centrality of cars in our society.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. No, that's super interesting. Do you have any other thoughts or anything we haven't talked about in this interview that you'd like to touch on?
Not that I can think of. I think I'll probably think of. I think I did actually think of some this afternoon and promptly forgot them again. And 10 minutes after we end the conversation, I'll probably think of another 10.
I relate a lot.
So yes, I think. What can I say? I don't know.
That's all right.
I think I think the important thing is we need a world in which everyone designs, and we don't need design geniuses for that. We just need. I think that's something I would like to emphasize is we need to develop respect for the design capabilities of ordinary people,
Mm-hmm.
people who are not geniuses, who are not artists, not maestros, in that sense of artists, who are artists in the sense of creating stuff, and not look down on what they create, and actually give them technological innovations which they can use to expand their possibility of being able to make things.
Yeah, absolutely. That's inspiring. Yeah. So, what's the best way for listeners who have also felt inspired to follow you or your work?
Well, I've after an interval of a couple of years, I've been writing a lot for C4SS again.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have a blog at the moment. Yes, I don't have a blog at the moment because I'm in a sort of position of changing direction in my life. So I'm not quite sure what's going to crystallize, whether it's in architecture, in writing, in the automotive end, or whatever, or the urban end. Hopefully, in due course, I'll have some sort of independent online presence. But at the moment, it's still a little bit up in the air.
So, I'll just encourage people to check out your articles on C4SS.
I think that would probably be best at the moment.
Awesome. Well, Dawie, thank you so much for coming on the Enragé.
Right, thank you.